Good afternoon. This is David Bernstein, President and CEO of the Jewish Council for Public Affairs. This is a CRCast, our bi-monthly episode on Jewish community relations and Jewish advocacy. And I'm really delighted to welcome a mentor of mine and really one of the great leaders and thinkers in the Jewish world, David Harris, CEO of the American Jewish Committee. David, it's really, really terrific to have you on, and we really appreciate your very valuable time.
David, thanks. Thanks for inviting me to speak to the JCPA audience.
Right. So in the interest of full disclosure, I spent 13 years at the American Jewish Committee and had the opportunity to work with you and to see you in action and to be part of what the AJC does around the world. And I know that there's that AJC brings a very particular methodology to its work and a way of thinking about the world. And I know that your tagline is Global Jewish Advocacy. And what is Global Jewish Advocacy?
And by the way, I would also add that we have a certain claim on Cheryl Fishbein as well, who's been an active lay member of AJC for many years. Global Jewish Advocacy, David, really came about in the early 1990s. It was after the fall of the Soviet Union when the world was dramatically changed. And we began to understand, maybe before Tom Friedman wrote his book, The World is Flat, that more and more of the issues we were dealing with were transnational in nature. Immigration was not an exclusively domestic issue. Energy was not an exclusively domestic issue. Hate, anti-Semitism, as the internet developed, was no longer an exclusively domestic issue. So whereas we used to think in terms of domestic issues and international issues, we began to think more about the globalizing of issues. And again, that was accelerated in many ways by the end of the Cold War. And we Jews have interests all over the world, both regional interests and thematic interests. Global Jewish Advocacy is a way of reflecting both the regional and the thematic around the world.
Okay, so AJC has infrastructure around the world, certainly offices in the US, global offices. Tell us a little bit about what you have that allows you to do this work globally.
Right, so we've been building a global architecture to meet the mission of Global Jewish Advocacy. Today we have 22 offices across the US. We just added our 11th overseas post. We have 6 posts in Europe. We obviously have a big office in Israel. We have 2 posts in Asia. And we have a post in Latin America as well. We also have regional institutes. So we have an African Institute, an Asian Institute, a Latin American Institute, a European Institute. We have thematic institutes, mostly built around interreligious and human rights questions. And we have 35 international partnerships now as well. So think, the One World Airline Alliance without the frequent flyer miles. So we've built this sort of structure where we're on every continent. We have boots on the ground. We have staff capacity. We have lay support, and we have engagement with lots of partners.
Great. So I've had the opportunity to see firsthand this work in action, the connections that AJC has globally, the world leaders who frequent AJC meetings and the meetings that you undertake abroad. Why would a foreign leader, a foreign minister, a head of state bother meeting with an American Jewish organization? What's in it for them?
Well, the answer is really quite simple, I think. If you want to have a friend in life, you need to be a friend. And countries around the world are looking for friends, especially here in the United States, which is the world's most powerful nation, economically, politically, militarily, and every other which way. So they're looking for people with whom to talk and to engage and to discuss not just issues of importance to us, but issues of importance to them. I think the mistake that's often made in Jewish advocacy, if I may say so, is to believe that today the world somehow owes us. I've seen this play out in some multi-organizational settings. The argument is made, look, because of the sins of omission and commission of the Shoah, or traditionally of anti-Semitism, the world owes us. Well, I have news. With the possible exception of Germany today, there's no nation on earth that I know that feels a sense of debt or onus to the Jewish community, number one. And number two, some people come in and believe that this is simply a debate between right and wrong, And if we can make the case that we're right and the other side is wrong, we're going to win. Politics is not just about right and wrong. It's largely about self-interest. And one has to combine the arguments about why our case is strong with why it's also in the interest of other nations to support Israel or to fight anti-Semitism or to defend democratic values. I know why it's in our interests. Why is it in their interests? So our goal is to frame arguments in a way that resonate not just with ourselves and our bleachers, but with the people we're trying to convince.
Great. So you form relationships globally. What do you talk about in these meetings with foreign ministers in Asia, in Europe, in Latin America? What's on the agenda?
Well, a number of things, David. Again, depends on the country, but speaking generally, I mean, we have concerns, for example, about the threat posed by Iran. When we're in Asia, we are also concerned about the fact that Iran and North Korea seem to continue to have linkages. So the concern that Japan and South Korea, for instance, may have about North Korea is combined with our concern about North Korean proliferation to the Middle East and specifically to links with Iran. So that's just one illustration of how there are overlapping concerns, if you can frame them that way. A second is we want to see Israel's global standing enhanced. And we want to help make the case that developing relations with Israel is not just an AJC priority because we're Jews and happen to care about Israel, but it ought to be a priority for nations on earth that are looking for 21st answers and solutions to problems they face, whether it's cybersecurity, whether it's water management or whatever. We have issues in the United Nations that come up periodically. The Zionism racism issue was the best example years ago, but there are issues today. Every nation on earth votes in the General Assembly, which means every nation is important to AJC and our agenda. Where there are Jewish communities, we're obviously talking about Jewish community issues as well, trying to help the local Jewish community to strengthen its position by showing that they're not alone, that a large American global organization stands with them in their concerns about property restitution or whatever the issue may be, David.
Great. So one of those issues in one of those countries that you deal with is Poland. And we were recently surprised, and I know some others were as well, that the Polish government passed legislation criminalizing the discussion of Poland's role in the Holocaust. What's been AJC's response to that?
Well, I have to say, firstly, that of all the Jewish organizations on earth outside Poland, this is the organization that has invested more in Polish-Jewish relations than any other. It began in the early 1980s with the Polish-American Jewish American Council here in the United States, which had a number of branches in Chicago and Detroit and other cities. It expanded to the Solidarity movement in Poland, which AJC supported. And then when Poland became a free, independent, and democratic nation in 1989, we made quantum leaps forward. So that's the background to this. We have a lot invested in the subject, David. The legislation was something we strongly opposed. And we want to believe that because we have such credibility on American Polish Jewish issues, we at least got a hearing. So far, we have not been able to change minds in Poland. We're hoping the Constitutional Court will do that for us. In the meantime, we've worked with the American authorities and the Israeli authorities, both of whom have strongly objected to the Polish legislation. We've stood strongly with the Jewish community in Poland, which feels a surge of anti-Semitism. And fortunately for us, 1 year ago this month, we opened an office in Poland. At the time, some people asked us, why would you open an office in Poland? Those people are not asking that question today.
One school of thought is that the Jewish world should cut ties to Poland. What's your thinking on that?
You know, that's easy when those who say it bear no consequences for what they say. In reality, Poland's an important country. There's been a strategic, I use the word strategic relationship with Israel. Poland has been a friend of Israel in the European Union. On the recent vote in the United Nations regarding Jerusalem, Poland was one of 6 EU countries that broke the consensus and abstained rather than follow Brussels' lead. There is a re-emerging Jewish community in Poland. It's small, but it's vibrant. There's a lot going on there. So it's easy for some to say, well, to hell with Poland. It's always been anti-Semitic. Poland is a big country, 35 to 40 million people. It's in the center of Europe. We can't afford to simply let it go. We have to fight the good fight. There are people in Poland on our side. Eventually, I suspect we will prevail. And we need to continue to build those relationships, we believe, David.
I'm going to invite our viewers to type in questions that we'll get to if we have time. So the next question really builds on the last one. Obviously, what we're seeing in Poland grows out of something much larger happening in Europe and globally. What do you see happening in Europe? How would you characterize anti-Semitism in Europe and the Jewish response to anti-Semitism in Europe?
AJC began because we have presence on the ground. We began to see a problem in 2000, 18 years ago. Some say we were among the very first to see it. We spent a lot of years trying to persuade European leaders to see the same problems that we were seeing. I could write a separate book on the subject of trying to persuade them to see what many preferred not to see. We also saw anti-Semitism coming, David, from not one source, but three sources. The reason I say that is because for many in Europe, as they began to wake up, they were most willing to see anti-Semitism from the far right, the neo-Nazi world, the populist xenophobic world, the National Front of France, the Golden Dawn in Greece, the Jobbik Party in Hungary, those kinds of parties. We got that. The problem was there were two other sources of anti-Semitism that were surfacing in Europe that they were less willing to see and that we kept insisting upon. One was the far left, and that was encapsulated in the obsession with Israel as for the BDS movement, for flotillas, for court cases. No other country in the world merited their attention, David. None. The only liberal democracy in the Middle East warranted their attention. And by the way, now you see this more mainstreamed in the Jeremy Corbynization of the British Labour Party. And what you see there is frankly very worrisome. And the third school that we kept talking about was the jihadist school. Not all Muslims in Europe, and there are an increasing number, are jihadists. Not all Muslims are anti-Semites, but it would be absolutely ridiculous to claim that none are, that there is no issue. And in fact, every single fatal attack against Jews in recent years, every single one has come from jihadists in Europe, whether in Denmark or in Belgium or in Bulgaria or in France or in other thwarted attempts. So these are the three main sources, and we believe Jews must be trifocal. One of the problems, David, is that in the very partisan world in which we live, if you're on the right, you only want to see the ills and sins of the left. If you're on the left, you're only willing to see the sins of the right. What we're saying as a nonpartisan organization is, if you want to look at Europe, if you want to look at the issue of anti-Semitism, get out of your ideological shell, open your eyes, and see reality as it is.
Thank you. Iran, you mentioned it already. Clearly, it's become the bully of the Middle East and the region, and the Israelis are trying to figure out their own strategy. The Iran deal itself is in limbo, and we're trying to figure out our own stance. How is it that we should deal with Iran and the U.S. policy toward Iran in this current environment? I'd love your thoughts.
Well, I'll try a second time. We tried a first time in 2015 with JCPA and we failed. But AJC waited till the deal was announced on July 14th, 2015. We took 23 days to study the deal from head to toe. John Kerry flew up from Washington to meet with our leadership. Wendy Sherman came separately. We consulted with lots of people in Europe and Israel and here. And after 23 days, we very respectfully but very clearly chose to oppose the deal. If you go back and read our statement, I submit, I think we were quite right. I say that, David, not to be triumphant. I wished we had been wrong. I wish that all of our assumptions had been proved incorrect. We had been told by the administration that the deal would moderate Iranian behavior. Moderate Iranian behavior. As you yourself just said a moment ago, quite the reverse has happened. Your term, Iran has become the bully of the Middle East. It now poses an existential threat to Israel, not just from Iran, but from its Syrian perch. Hezbollah is stronger thanks to Iranian support. President Assad, the human rights bully, has been bolstered by Iran. Iran is in Bahrain. Iran is in Yemen. The evidence of moderation of Iranian behavior we can't find. Today, we do not want to see the deal scrapped. Let me be clear. We opposed the deal 3 years ago. We're not calling for the deal to be scrapped. What we are saying, though, is there are major flaws in the deal, and the U.S. with our European allies have to address them. The major flaws being ballistic missile development was largely untouched by the deal. Big omission. The sunset clause means that at some point the deal comes to an end and Iran has a more or less legitimate pathway to nuclear threshold status. Regional behavior, support for Hamas and Hezbollah, untouched by the deal. And inspections, only partially covered, not entirely covered. And what about Iranian dealings in North Korea, for example? Who's monitoring and inspecting those, because the IAEA doesn't get to go to North Korea? So Iran, for us, is going in the wrong direction. It poses a threat not just to Israel, but to our Arab allies, to American interests. And I think we got to circle around this together, David, hopefully as a Jewish community.
Right. Do you think the U.S. has the leverage to change European attitudes on this, to bring them along?
I think in a way it does. I'm not here to try and interpret Donald Trump. That's a tough job. But I think the fact that Donald Trump's unconventional style, which essentially says to the Europeans, I'm the great disruptor. I don't care about convention. I don't care about diplomatic niceties and pinstriped suits. You know what? To hell with the deal. I'm ready to scrap it. You don't believe me? You think I'm bluffing? Try me. Now, says Donald Trump, do I have your attention in Brussels, Berlin, Paris, and London? Let's talk. And let's see if we can strike something, because the alternative is you don't know if I'm ready to tear up the deal. The Europeans want to keep the deal at all costs. So I cannot say if this is Donald Trump as impulse president or Donald Trump as chess playing president. I don't know which one it is. But I think he's trying to get the Europeans' attention and convince them they've got to get off their backsides and do something, or else we may be entering a new phase. And with Mike Pompeo as the new Secretary of State, Trump has made a major strategic decision. Tillerson supported the deal. It's not clear to me that Pompeo supports the deal. He's sending a very strong message to the world. Don't count on this deal continuing after May 12th.
So another issue that we've made mention of, but I think we could go deeper on, is the United Nations. The UN has been biased toward Israel as long as I can remember in my entire life. And I know AJC and you have been at it for a very, very long time. Can you tell us, first of all, a little bit about that political dynamic, why it's that way, and what levers that we might have to bring to bear in dealing with that bias?
So you're absolutely right. You've been focused on it a long time. I'm older than you. I've been focused on it even longer. There has been some progress, by the way, David. I mean, to be fair, before we get to the difficulties, Zionism as racism was adopted by the General Assembly in 1975. It took 16 years of blood, toil, tears, and sweat, including AJC's. In 91, it was repealed. For the first 51 years of Israel's existence at the UN, it had no access to the Security Council. In 2000, again, if I may add, with AJC's sweat equity, it became eligible, and it's running right now for the first time in its history for the Security Council. Danny Danon, the Israeli ambassador, is chairing one of the 6 standing committees of the UN. That never happened before. So to be fair to the larger picture, there has been some progress, and we should never say it's impossible. On the other hand, there's structural and systemic bias against Israel at the UN. And the more one looks into this, the more horrifying it becomes. Probably best known as the Human Rights Council in Geneva, which has a standing agenda And one of the standing agenda items is an item on Israel, and only Israel. Every other nation on the planet is reviewed under a separate agenda item. North Korea, Iran, Syria, Cuba, Venezuela, you name it, all the real culprits. Israel has its own standing agenda item. Israel is the target of about 20 UN General Assembly resolutions each and every year, more than any other nation on earth. You can go down the list, David. Now, can we do something about it? The answer is yes, because I've seen what can be done. But it's not for the faint-hearted. There are no quick solutions. It's not about one meeting, one time, with one ambassador in one place. It's sustained effort here across the country with consulates, with embassies, with the mission to the UN. It's the kind of travel we do all year to about 115 countries. The UN is always on our agenda. But again, going back to what you asked earlier, if it's about special pleading, it's not going to work. It has to be explained in terms of why it's in another country's interests to change its vote. A few months ago, I got a phone call from the ambassador of Mexico. The ambassador of Mexico to the UN had been on an AJC project interchange trip to Israel with other ambassadors. He came back, he spoke with the foreign ministry, he called me very happily and he said, David, we have agreed to change our position on 13 UN General Assembly votes regarding Israel. Instead of automatically supporting the Palestinians, we're moving to an abstention. We now understand the conflict is much more complicated than we thought. India has begun to change some of its votes from automatic support of the Palestinians to more abstentions. Not impossible, a lot of work and a lot of thought about how you frame the arguments so it resonates, the arguments resonate not with us, but with the people we're trying to reach.
So you've mentioned a couple success stories in Jewish diplomacy. Can you give us a few more, maybe outside the United Nations context, bilateral success stories in which we've been able to get a country to do something that it might not have done otherwise without our interventions?
Yeah, I mean, for me, one of my favorite, because it's a story I know well, is Japan. For decades after Israel's creation, Japan, by and large, adhered to the Arab economic boycott against Israel. And major Japanese companies, if their products were available in Israel, were usually sent through third countries and rebranded as made in Singapore or whatever. But otherwise, they wouldn't touch the Israeli market. They were afraid of retribution from the Arab Economic Office in Damascus, Syria. We started going to Tokyo, and in a span of about 5 or 6 years, we went 18 separate times. The first time we met, we essentially met with the doorman of the foreign ministry. They didn't know what to do with us. You know, who was this group AJC? Why were American Jews coming? After a while, we began meeting with the foreign minister himself, with the Minister of International Trade and Industry, with members of the emperor's family, with the prime minister's office. And essentially what we said, David, was we're not asking you to change your position on the boycott simply as a gift to us, AJC and American Jews. We're asking you to do it as a gift to yourselves, because you're denying yourselves access to one of the most exciting, innovative, and complementary economies to Israel on the planet. And you're allowing other third countries to bully you and to dictate your economic policy. Japan at the time was the second largest economy in the world. Today it's the third. And we're telling you that they may bang the table and they may come with a diplomatic démarche, but the day after they'll be back doing deals with you. And that's exactly what happened. The foreign minister told an AJC delegation, we've changed our policy, we've informed Japanese companies. The foreign ministry held a press conference. The question was asked, why did you change? And here I think is part of the answer for the community relations field. The answer was because of the patient and perseverant diplomacy of the American Jewish Committee, which took the time to understand how Japan works. If you take that one sentence, it doesn't matter whether you're AJC or CRC or APAC, take that one sentence, patient, perseverant. You took the time to understand how Japan works. We turned around one of the world's largest economies. The Japan-Israel relationship today is booming in 100 different directions. It's continuing to grow. And it all happened because we were persistent and because we helped the Japanese understand why it was not just in our interest, why it was in their interest.
Great. So my last question to you, we like to bring things local if we can.
Sure.
You mentioned that AJC has 22 offices around the United States in addition to its international offices and its offices in New York and Washington. What role does a local AJC regional office play in global Jewish diplomacy?
Yeah, it's a great question. And the answer is, it depends which office. So first of all, we begin with the fact that of our 22 offices, roughly 12 or 13 are located in cities that we call global cities, meaning that in a way, those cities, be it Houston, Los Angeles, San Francisco, Chicago, Miami, Atlanta, Boston, obviously New York, Washington, cities like that, like those, replicate the global agenda locally. They do so because they have diplomats. They do so because they have world-class universities and thinkers and opinion molders. They do so because they have large concentrations of different ethnic and religious communities that we're interested in coalition building with. So in those cities, it's very easy to bring the global agenda local. In other cities, it can be a little more difficult. So one of the ways we've been considering is, how do you twin AJC regional offices with countries and communities abroad, so you give them a more personal stake, but not in the sense of twinning as federations have done with Israeli cities for social welfare projects, but rather to make sure that other countries and communities know that they have a friend in the United States that takes an interest in them. And then, of course, through our AJC Global Forum, we give everyone from all of our regional offices the chance to interact, because at our Global Forum, we have advocacy and action dinners. We have several dozen dinners with ambassadors. We invite all of our local leaders to come to meet with the ambassadors, to interact with the ambassadors. And now, David, we've also introduced regional diplomatic marathons. So, for example, while we have a New York diplomatic marathon when the UN opens in September, and we have 60, 70, 80 private meetings, we now have regional diplomatic marathons in Chicago and in Los Angeles and in Houston and Miami and other cities, and we invite the surrounding AJC offices to join. So Chicago will be joined by Detroit, by St. Louis, by Cleveland, by Cincinnati. And they'll all come together for a blitz of a day or two to meet with the consuls generals of various countries, to make the case, to establish friendships, and by the way, to invite those diplomats to come to the cities. Remember, these diplomats may be based in Chicago or Houston, but they're responsible for 6, 8, 10 states. They're looking for relationships, they're looking for contacts, and they know the Jewish community is considered influential. They welcome the invitations. So I say the same for CRCs. Let's partner, AJC regional offices and CRCs, in this kind of diplomatic work and extend the impact and the reach of all of our collective efforts.
Sounds like an excellent idea to me. David, thank you for your time. Thank you for being such an eloquent and compelling spokesperson for the Jewish world. It's invaluable work, and we really appreciate the partnership with the American Jewish Committee. Please tune in to the next episode of the CRCast. We're going to be hosting CEO of the Convergence Center for Policy Resolution, Robert Furch. It's going to be on polarization in the political system. You all know that this is one of the big threats that we're all facing in this country, a polarized political discourse. And this is an opportunity to hear from one of the real top experts in dealing with this issue, how we can overcome polarization and what we can do about it. So thank you all for being with us. Thank you, David Harris. And we will see you next time on March 28th, 4 p.m., Wednesday, March 28th at 4 p.m. Take care.